The tension in the House Judiciary Committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Senator Tim Scott sat across from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, his jaw clenched tight as he leaned into the microphone. What started as a routine hearing about civil rights enforcement was about to explode into one of the most dramatic political showdowns of the year. Congresswoman Crockett, Scott's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You've been spreading lies about Republican voting records, and I'm here to call you out on it. His eyes blazed with the confidence of someone who thought he had an airtight case. But Crockett just smiled. A calm, knowing smile that should have been Tim Scott's first warning sign. What happened in the next 30 minutes would leave Scott speechless, destroy his argument completely, and turn Jasmine Crockett into a viral sensation overnight. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was about to become a masterclass in how to shut down an opponent with nothing but cold, hard facts. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the latest political drama. The committee room fell silent as both politicians stared each other down. Scott thought he had the upper hand. Crockett knew better. What she was about to pull out would change everything. At 58 years old, Tim Scott had built his reputation as the Republican Party's most prominent black voice in the Senate. Born in North Charleston, South Carolina, Scott had risen from poverty to become a powerful political figure. As the only black Republican in the Senate, he carried significant weight in discussions about race and civil rights. Scott's political brand was built on the idea of conservative solutions to racial inequality. He often criticized Democrats for what he called empty promises to black communities. His personal story of success through hard work and conservative principles made him a frequent Fox News guest and a rising star in Republican circles. But Scott had a problem. Recent polling showed his approval ratings dropping among black voters, and Democrats had been hammering Republicans on voting rights issues. He needed a big moment to prove his relevance and push back against Democratic narratives. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43, was everything Tim Scott wasn't expecting to face. A former public defender and civil rights attorney from Dallas, Texas, Crockett had only been in Congress for 2 years, but she'd already made waves with her sharp questioning and fearless approach to taking on Republican talking points. Crockett grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where she witnessed firsthand the impact of systemic inequality. She'd built her legal career defending people who couldn't defend themselves, and that fighting spirit had followed her to Washington. Unlike many politicians who spoke in careful, measured tones, Crockett had a direct, no-nonsense style that connected with younger voters and social media audiences. What Scott didn't know was that Crockett had spent weeks preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Her team had been tracking Republican voting records, statements, and positions with the precision of a detective building a case. She didn't just come to debates with talking points. She came with receipts. This confrontation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was taking place during a critical moment in American politics, with voting rights, civil rights enforcement, and racial justice dominating headlines. Both Scott and Crockett knew that this exchange would be clipped, shared, and analyzed across social media platforms. For Scott, this was his chance to establish dominance over a relatively new Democrat and prove his conservative credentials to the Republican base. He'd been facing criticism from some conservatives who questioned whether he was tough enough on liberal policies. For Crockett, this was an opportunity to expose what she saw as Republican hypocrisy on civil rights issues. She'd been building a reputation as someone who could take on senior Republicans and win, and a victory here would solidify her status as a rising Democratic star. The setting made everything more intense. The House Judiciary Committee room was packed with reporters, staffers, and cameras. C-SPAN was broadcasting live, and political Twitter was already buzzing with anticipation. Everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. Scott had requested this hearing ostensibly to discuss civil rights enforcement, but everyone knew it was really about politics. He wanted to put Democrats on the defensive and create sound bites that would play well with Republican voters. Crockett had accepted the challenge eagerly. Her staff had warned her that Scott was known for his debate skills and his ability to stay calm under pressure. But Crockett had faced tougher opponents in courtrooms across Texas. She wasn't intimidated. The broader context made this moment even more significant. With midterm elections approaching and both parties fighting for control of Congress, every public confrontation carried extra weight. Political careers could be made or broken in moments like these. As the hearing began, neither politician knew they were about to participate in a moment that would be analyzed, memed, and referenced for years to come. The stage was set for a political earthquake. Tim Scott didn't waste any time with pleasantries. As soon as he was recognized by the committee chair, he launched into what he clearly thought would be a devastating attack. "Madam Chair, I want to address something that's been troubling me deeply," Scott began, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "For months, we've heard Congresswoman Crockett and her Democratic colleagues making claims about Republican voting records that are simply false." He turned to face Crockett directly, his eyes narrowing. "Specifically, Congresswoman, you've been telling your constituents and the American people that Republicans have consistently voted against civil rights legislation. You've said we don't support black communities. You've painted us as enemies of progress." The room grew quieter as Scott's voice rose slightly. "These aren't just political disagreements. These are lies. And as the only black Republican in the Senate, I find these lies particularly offensive." Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She'd been expecting this exact line of attack, Scott continued, clearly building to what he thought was his knockout punch. "I've served in Congress for over a decade. I've voted for criminal justice reform, opportunity zones in underserved communities, and funding for historically black colleges and universities. The idea that I or my Republican colleagues don't care about civil rights is not just wrong, it's dangerous." But then Scott made a critical error. Emboldened by what he perceived as Crockett's silence, he decided to get more specific. "Just last month, Congresswoman, you claimed that Republicans voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You said we were trying to suppress black voters. That's a lie, and you know it." A slight smile crossed Crockett's face, but she remained silent. Scott pressed on, not noticing the warning sign. "You also claimed that Republicans opposed funding for civil rights enforcement in the Justice Department. Another lie. You're spreading misinformation to score political points, and it needs to stop." The tension in the room was building. Republican committee members were nodding approvingly at Scott's comments. Democratic members looked concerned, some whispering among themselves. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured, a stark contrast to Scott's rising intensity. "Senator Scott, I appreciate your passion on this issue," she began, her Texas accent adding a slight drawl to her words. "And I want to be very clear about something from the start. I never said Republicans don't care about civil rights. What I said, and what I'll continue to say, is that Republican voting records don't match Republican rhetoric." Scott's confidence faltered slightly, but he pressed forward. "That's exactly the kind of misleading statement I'm talking about. You're creating false narratives." "Senator, are you suggesting that I should ignore actual voting records when I'm evaluating political positions?" Crockett asked, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor questioning a hostile witness. "I'm suggesting you should tell the truth instead of cherry-picking votes to support your agenda," Scott shot back. The exchange was getting heated now. Committee members on both sides were leaning forward, and the reporters in the room were frantically taking notes. Crockett leaned back in her chair, a move that somehow made her appear more confident rather than defensive. "Senator Scott, since you brought up truth-telling, let me ask you a direct question. Did you vote for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act when it came before the Senate?" Scott's pause was barely perceptible, but Crockett caught it. "The bill was flawed, Congresswoman. It would have—" "That's not what I asked, Senator. Did you vote for it? Yes or no?" "I voted against a flawed piece of legislation that would have—" "So you voted against it," Crockett interrupted, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge. "When you accuse me of lying about your voting record, but then admit you voted exactly the way I said you did, who's really being dishonest here?" The room was getting uncomfortable now. Scott could feel the momentum shifting, but he was too committed to back down. "Congresswoman, you're oversimplifying complex legislation. The John Lewis Act, as written, would have federalized elections in ways that violated states' rights. My vote was about preserving constitutional principles, not opposing voting rights." Crockett nodded slowly, as if she was considering his argument. "I see. So when you vote against voting rights legislation, it's about constitutional principles. When Democrats vote for it, we're just playing politics. Is that your position? I'm saying Democrats wrote a bill they knew Republicans couldn't support, then used our votes against us for political gain, Scott replied, his voice rising again. Senator, that's a very interesting theory, Crockett said, and now her smile was becoming more pronounced. Since you're so concerned about accuracy and truth-telling, would you like to know what you said about the John Lewis Act before you voted against it? Scott's expression changed slightly. For the first time, he looked uncertain. I think the American people would be very interested to hear your own words on this subject, Crockett continued, reaching for a folder that had been sitting in front of her throughout the entire exchange. The room fell silent as Crockett opened the folder. Scott tried to maintain his composure, but everyone could see that something had shifted. The confident senator who had started this confrontation was now looking like a man who was beginning to realize he might have walked into a trap. Actually, Senator, since you've accused me of lying about Republican voting records, I think this would be a perfect time to examine the record in detail, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was about to deliver a knockout blow. Scott glanced around the room, perhaps looking for support from his Republican colleagues, but everyone was focused on Crockett and whatever she was about to reveal. The folder in front of Crockett seemed to grow larger in the silence. Whatever was in there, everyone in the room could sense it was about to change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. Crockett looked up from the folder and locked eyes with Scott. Senator, are you ready to discuss the actual record? Crockett pulled out the first document with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making an incision. The paper crinkled slightly in the silent room as she held it up. Senator Scott, this is a transcript from your interview on Fox News Sunday, March 15, 2023. Would you like me to read your exact words about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act? Scott's face had gone from confident to cautious. Congresswoman, I stand by everything I've said about that legislation. I'm sure you do, Crockett replied, her voice now dripping with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. Let me quote you directly. The John Lewis Act is well-intentioned, but it goes too far in federalizing elections. However, I recognize the importance of protecting voting rights, and I'm committed to working with Democrats to find common ground. She looked up from the paper. You said you were committed to working with Democrats to find common ground on voting rights. That was 8 months ago. Can you tell me about all the bipartisan voting rights legislation you've introduced or co-sponsored since then? The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Scott shifted in his seat. Congresswoman, legislative processes take time. The answer is 0, Senator, Crockett interrupted, pulling out another document. 0 bills introduced, 0 bills co-sponsored, 0 amendments offered, 0 committee hearings requested. But you did vote against 3 separate voting rights measures that came to the floor. Crockett was just getting started. She pulled out a thick stack of papers and placed them deliberately on the table in front of her. Since you've accused me of lying about Republican voting records, let's go through your record systematically, Senator. This is your voting record on civil rights and voting rights legislation over the past 5 years. She lifted the first page. The For the People Act, you voted against it. The Freedom to Vote Act, you voted against it. The Protecting the Right to Organize Act, you voted against it. The Equality Act, you voted against it. With each bill she named, she placed a paper down on the table with a slight thud that echoed in the silent room. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, you voted against it. The Crown Act, which would prohibit discrimination based on natural hair, you voted against it. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Oh wait, you did vote for that one eventually, after it passed the House by a vote of 422 to 3. A few people in the room actually gasped at that last detail. Scott tried to interrupt. Congresswoman, you're taking these votes out of context. Each of these bills had problematic provisions that... Senator, I'm not taking anything out of context. I'm simply reading your voting record, Crockett replied, her voice remaining calm even as her attack intensified. But since you mentioned context, let's talk about context. Crockett pulled out another document, this one looking more official with a government seal visible at the top. This is a press release from your office from February 2022. In it you wrote, and I quote, The federal government has a constitutional responsibility to protect voting rights and ensure equal access to the ballot for all Americans. Your words, Senator. Your letterhead. She looked up at Scott with the expression of a lawyer who had just caught a witness in a lie. So, help me understand, Senator. When it's convenient for a press release, the federal government has a constitutional responsibility to protect voting rights. But when it comes time to actually vote for legislation that would protect voting rights, suddenly it's unconstitutional federal overreach. Which is it? Scott's face was flushed now. Congresswoman, there's a difference between supporting the principle of voting rights and supporting flawed legislation that— Senator, Crockett interrupted, you just spent the last 10 minutes accusing me of lying about your record. I've shown you your own words and your own votes. Who's lying here? But Crockett wasn't done. She reached into her folder and pulled out what looked like a printed email chain. Senator, since we're talking about honesty and accuracy, I think the American people should know about this email exchange between your staff and lobbyists from the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Scott's eyes widened. This was clearly something he hadn't expected. These emails, which were obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request by the watchdog group documented, show your staff coordinating talking points with conservative organizations specifically to oppose voting rights legislation. She held up the papers. In one email, your chief of staff writes, "The senator is willing to be the lead black voice against the John Lewis Act, but we need better talking points about why this is actually bad for black voters." The room erupted. Republican committee members were trying to speak over each other, Democrats were demanding order, and reporters were frantically typing. Crockett's voice cut through the chaos. So not only did you vote against voting rights legislation, Senator, you actively coordinated with outside groups to develop messaging to convince black voters that voting rights legislation was bad for them. And then you have the audacity to sit here and accuse me of lying? Scott was now visibly agitated, all pretense of calm authority gone. Congresswoman, those emails are taken out of context. My staff routinely communicates with various organizations. Senator, stop, Crockett said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his protests. Just stop. You've accused me of lying about your record. I've shown you your record. You've accused me of spreading misinformation. I've shown you your own words contradicting your votes. You've accused me of playing politics. I've shown you emails of you literally coordinating political messaging. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, but still carrying clearly through the microphone. Every accusation you've made against me is actually a confession of what you've been doing. That's called projection, Senator, and the American people can see right through it. Crockett reached into her folder one more time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She held it up so the cameras could see it clearly. This, Senator, is a memo from your office to Republican leadership dated just last week. In it, you propose a strategy to neutralize Democratic attacks on Republican civil rights records by putting forward a black Republican spokesperson to challenge their narratives. The room went completely silent except for the sound of camera shutters and typing. You didn't come here today because you were offended by lies about your record, Senator. You came here because you thought you could use your race as a shield while you attacked me for telling the truth about your voting record. You thought you could intimidate a black woman into backing down from facts by accusing her of lying. Crockett's voice grew stronger with each word. But I'm not intimidated by you, Senator Scott. I'm a former public defender. I've faced down judges, prosecutors, and politicians who thought they could silence me. And I have something you clearly don't have, the receipts to back up everything I say. She gestured to the pile of documents now spread across the table in front of her. This is your record, Senator. These are your words. These are your votes. These are your emails. I didn't lie about any of it. I just read it back to you. Tim Scott sat in his chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He tried one last time to salvage the situation. Congresswoman, the American people understand that governing requires nuanced decisions. Senator, Crockett interrupted, her voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering a final verdict. The American people understand when someone has been caught red-handed trying to gaslight them. You accused me of lying. I proved you wrong with your own words and your own actions. The only question now is whether you're going to apologize for your false accusations or if you're going to double down on dishonesty. Scott stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I think there may have been some miscommunication about my positions. Senator, Crockett said, cutting him off one final time. There was no miscommunication. There was just you getting called out for your record, and you not being prepared for someone who actually did their homework. She gathered up her documents and placed them back in the folder. I think this hearing has been very educational for the American people. They've learned exactly what kind of civil rights record you actually have, and they've seen exactly what happens when someone tries to silence truth with false accusations. The committee chair called for a recess, but the damage was already done. Tim Scott had walked into the room thinking he would destroy Jasmine Crockett's credibility. Instead, he'd been systematically dismantled by his own record. Before the committee had even officially recessed, the video clips were already spreading across social media like wildfire. The moment when Crockett pulled out the email exchanges had been captured by multiple cameras, and within minutes, it was being shared on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The hashtag #Crockett receipts began trending within 30 minutes of the hearing's end. Political Twitter exploded with reactions from both sides of the aisle, but even many conservative commentators had to admit that Scott had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. A prominent conservative journalist tweeted, "I'm no fan of Crockett's politics, but you have to respect someone who comes that prepared to a fight." Scott walked into a buzzsaw. Meanwhile, liberal accounts were having a field day. The official Democratic Party Twitter account shared a clip of Crockett saying, "I have the receipts to back up everything I say," with the caption, "This is what preparation looks like." Within hours, every major cable news network was analyzing the confrontation. CNN ran a segment titled, "When Preparation Meets Accusation, How Jasmine Crockett Destroyed Tim Scott's Attack." MSNBC's Rachel Maddow devoted an entire segment to breaking down each document Crockett had presented. Even Fox News, typically friendly to Republican senators, struggled to defend Scott's performance. During their evening panel discussion, one host admitted, "Look, regardless of your politics, Scott got caught unprepared. You can't accuse someone of lying and then get proven wrong with your own documents." The clips were particularly devastating because they showed such a clear before and after transformation. Video of Scott's confident opening attack, where he accused Crockett of lying, was being contrasted with footage of his deflated final response, where he mumbled about miscommunication. Political commentators were calling it one of the most thorough political dismantlings they'd seen in years. The fact that it happened in a congressional hearing, with official records and documents, made it impossible for Scott's team to claim the evidence was fabricated or taken out of context. Tim Scott's office went into full crisis mode immediately after the hearing. His communications director released a statement within 2 hours, trying to reframe the encounter. Senator Scott stands by his commitment to civil rights and his record of supporting practical solutions to advance opportunity for all Americans. Today's hearing demonstrated the need for more substantive policy discussions rather than political theater. But the statement only made things worse. Social media users immediately began sharing side-by-side comparisons of the statement with the actual footage from the hearing. The disconnect between Scott's team claiming political theater and the video evidence of him being systematically fact-checked was stark. Scott attempted to go on Sean Hannity's show that evening to explain his side of the story, but even the friendly interview couldn't undo the damage. When Hannity asked about the emails Crockett had referenced, Scott was forced to admit they were authentic while trying to explain why coordinating opposition messaging wasn't problematic. The interview clips ended up generating even more negative coverage. Political analysts noted that Scott seemed defensive and unprepared even when given softball questions from a sympathetic host. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, played her post-hearing strategy perfectly. Rather than gloating or attacking Scott personally, she stayed focused on the substantive issues. In her immediate post-hearing press conference, she said, "Today wasn't about embarrassing Senator Scott. It was about showing the American people the importance of looking at actual records rather than just rhetoric. When politicians make accusations, we should demand they back them up with facts." Her measured response actually made Scott's performance look even worse by comparison. While he was making excuses and deflecting, she was talking about policy and accountability. Crockett's team also strategically released additional documents over the following days, keeping the story alive in the news cycle. They published a comprehensive website detailing Scott's voting record on civil rights issues, complete with video clips of his statement and copies of the documents she'd referenced in the hearing. The confrontation had implications far beyond just these two politicians. Political strategists on both sides began analyzing what lessons could be learned from Crockett's performance. Democratic operatives took note of her preparation strategy. The idea of bringing actual documents, emails, and voting records to political confrontations became known as the Crockett method. Campaign managers across the country began instructing their candidates to prepare opposition research folders for debates and public appearances. Republican strategists, meanwhile, were forced to confront some uncomfortable realities about their messaging strategies. The fact that Scott's own emails had been used against him highlighted the risks of coordinating too closely with outside groups and the importance of message discipline. The confrontation also elevated Crockett's national profile significantly. Democratic fundraising groups reported that she'd received hundreds of thousands of dollars in small-dollar donations in the days following the hearing. Political commentators began mentioning her as a rising star who could potentially seek statewide or even national office. For Tim Scott, the political damage was substantial and lasting. His approval ratings among black voters, already low, dropped even further in post-hearing polls. More damaging was the impact on his standing within the Republican Party. Scott had built his political brand on being the GOP's most credible voice on racial issues. The emails Crockett revealed showed him working with outside groups to develop talking points against civil rights legislation, undermining his carefully crafted image as an independent voice. Conservative donors and activists began questioning whether Scott was the right messenger for their causes. If he couldn't handle a confrontation with a second-term Congresswoman, how could he be trusted in bigger political battles? Perhaps most damaging was the way the confrontation revealed Scott's preparation style. Political opponents now knew that he could be vulnerable if challenged with detailed factual evidence. Future debates and hearings would be much more difficult for him as opponents prepared their own receipt folders. Political scientists and campaign strategists began studying exactly how Crockett had managed such a complete victory. Her approach became a case study in opposition research and debate preparation. First, she had clearly anticipated Scott's line of attack. Her team had prepared for exactly the accusations he made, suggesting they'd done extensive research on his past statements and likely strategies. Second, she'd organized her evidence strategically. Rather than overwhelming him with everything at once, she'd revealed damaging information gradually, allowing each piece to land before moving to the next. Third, she'd maintained her composure throughout, never appearing angry or defensive even when under attack. This made Scott's increasing agitation look even worse by comparison. Finally, she'd focused on facts rather than personal attacks. By sticking to voting records, official statements, and documented communications, she'd made it impossible for Scott to dismiss her arguments as partisan rhetoric. The aftermath of the hearing also demonstrated how political confrontations had evolved in the social media age. Traditional metrics like who won a debate were now determined as much by online engagement as by expert analysis. Crockett's team had clearly prepared for the social media battle as much as the actual hearing. They'd made sure key moments were captured on video from multiple angles, and they'd prepared graphics and fact checks that could be easily shared online. The speed with which #CrockettReceipts trended showed how quickly political narratives could be established and reinforced through social media. Within hours, the story had moved from a committee hearing to a viral moment that reached millions of people who never would have watched C-SPAN. The Scott-Crockett confrontation became required viewing for political operatives across the country. The clear lesson was that in the modern political environment, accusations without evidence were not just ineffective, they were dangerous. Politicians could no longer rely on rhetoric and talking points alone. Opponents were increasingly likely to come prepared with detailed factual rebuttals, complete with documentation and evidence. The confrontation also showed the importance of message discipline and internal communication security. Scott's downfall came largely from his own emails and statements being used against him, highlighting the need for better operational security in political organizations. For voters, the hearing provided a clear example of why they should demand evidence when politicians make accusations. Crockett's methodical fact-checking showed how much more effective political discourse could be when participants came prepared with actual documentation. Beyond the immediate political implications, the hearing represented something larger about accountability in American politics. For too long, politicians had been able to make accusations without fear of immediate, factual rebuttal. Crockett's performance showed what was possible when someone took the time to do the research and prepare the evidence. Her systematic destruction of Scott's arguments wasn't just good television, it was good democracy. The hearing also highlighted the importance of transparency in political communications. The emails that proved so damaging to Scott had been obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, showing how sunshine laws could be used to hold politicians accountable for their behind-the-scenes activities. In the weeks following the confrontation, other members of Congress began changing how they prepared for hearings and public appearances. The Crockett method of bringing documentation to back up every claim became increasingly common. Committee staff members reported that members were requesting much more extensive opposition research before participating in hearings where they might face challenging questions. The days of politicians being able to rely solely on talking points and rhetoric were clearly ending. The confrontation also changed how political journalists covered congressional hearings. Rather than just reporting on what was said, reporters began focusing more on the evidence presented and the accuracy of claims made by participants. As the dust settled from the hearing, political observers agreed that Jasmine Crockett had set a new standard for how political confrontations should be conducted. By coming prepared with facts, maintaining her composure, and focusing on substance over style, she'd shown how much more effective political discourse could be. Tim Scott's defeat became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making accusations without evidence. His fall from confident accuser to deflated defendant served as a warning to other politicians who might be tempted to rely on rhetoric rather than facts. The hearing proved that in an age of social media and instant fact-checking, politicians who came unprepared would be exposed quickly and thoroughly. The American people had shown they were hungry for substance over style, and politicians who could deliver facts would have significant advantages over those who relied on talking points. As we continue to navigate an increasingly polarized political landscape, the Scott-Crockett confrontation provides a roadmap for how political discourse can be both passionate and factual. It shows that the most powerful weapon in politics isn't rhetoric or charisma, it's preparation and truth. Thanks for watching this incredible breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett completely destroyed Tim Scott's argument with nothing but facts and preparation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into political strategy and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest political analysis. Drop a comment below and let us know what other political confrontations you'd like us to analyze. Until next time, remember, in politics, as in life, the truth always wins when someone's brave enough to speak it.